All right, we're going to take a look at chapter 11, and rather than kind of just do a lecture, we're going to kind of do a little bit of a guided reading here and go through some of the important parts of the chapter because you're going to be continuing to use this as you prep for your doing your SLO writing, doing your essay writing later on. So let's kind of go through some of the important parts here and hit the highlights. Okay, the chapter 11 really, if you look at the objectives here, okay, talks about a couple things that the major objectives of this chapter deal with parts of what is considered to be the Old South. Okay, in graduate school or even in if you're a history major, yeah, there's a class that is called Old South, and this is the the antebellum South, the South before the war. What the chapter is going to do, if you look at the objectives here, is talk about the South, what made the South distinct from the rest of the United States. And we've already talked a little bit about this because the answer is number 2. Discuss the role that cotton production and slavery played in the South's economic and social development. So essentially, the chapter is going to be taking you through why cotton becomes king. What made the agricultural South shift to cotton? Was it profitable? How was it profitable? Why did it become the backbone of the South's economic development? And of course, that also bleeds over into how the South organized its society as well. Which then takes us into number 3, distinguish among the major groups within Southern white society and explain why each group supported the expansion of slavery. Then you're going to switch over and talk about the impact of slavery on African Americans, both free and enslaved throughout the South. And then finally analyze how enslaved peoples responded to the inhumanity of their situation. So that's what the chapter is going to take us through. Make sure that you read or watch each of these videos. They give you some great insight into what's happening. So please watch them. They will help set the table for you, and they will really explain what's going on. Well, the most important paragraphs in this early part of the chapter is right here. Okay, the southern states remained rural, agricultural, long after the rest of the nation had embraced cities, immigrants, and factories. But the Old South was also instrumental in enabling the nation's industrial development and its growing economic stature. After the War of 1812, Southern-grown cotton became the key raw material driving the Industrial Revolution by feeding the textile mills of Great Britain and New England, whose wage workers and machines fashioned it into thread, yarn, bedding, and clothing. The price of raw cotton doubled in the first year after the war, and investors in Boston, New York City, and Philadelphia provided loans to Southerners to buy more land, more slaves, put more land under cultivation, raise more cotton. And this is how cotton really becomes the key to Southern development. The textbook kind of takes a look at, remember, of course, don't forget to watch the videos, okay? I'm telling you, they're going to be really helpful. What made the Old South most distinctive wasn't that it was an agricultural area. It wasn't that it was a different climate or had different soils. It does, okay? But it's the peculiar institution, what Calhoun called the peculiar institution, slavery, okay? Slavery was what made the difference, okay? It is what made the South so much different. It is key. It's pivotal to the South's economy. It is what enables the South to transition towards cotton, and it is the most important thing in the South. You cannot disentangle the Old South and slavery. It runs through every thread, every fiber of the Old South's being. Now, one of the things that the book tries to kind of get you through is some of the myths about the Old South. Okay, some of the things that made the Old South, or that we kind of associate with the Old South, that are probably more myth than anything. Okay. Number one, Southerners claimed that their region was morally superior. Kind planters, okay, looked after the slaves, food, clothing, shelter, and security, in contrast to a North where greedy bankers and factory owners worked their wage laborers to death, worked them worse than slaves. Okay, this is sometimes called the positive good idea. Okay, the southern slave owner as a benevolent overseer. Okay, the South tried to cultivate this. Okay, that this was a excuse me a this was an agrarian area, that this was an ideal area. Okay, populated by slave owners who cared about the slaves and who were just happy to be working, and they were treated much better than late wage earners in the North. Okay, that is not true. And of course, Northerners believed it was exactly the opposite. Especially abolitionists tried to paint the region as immoral and as morally corrupt. Okay, so keep that up and keep that idea sort of going. When you get to Harriet Beecher Stowe, for example, in Uncle Tom's Cabin and other things, you begin to see the chinks in the armor coming out. And they tried to expose slavery as it really was. Okay, trying to undo that positive good idea. The the South is a very different region. Okay, and sometimes we don't understand that. Okay, the textbook points out that there are really three distinct subsections of the South. Okay, the lower South, which is South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and parts of Texas, okay, are dependent upon commercial cotton. It's really their only source of income in a lot of ways. And they were really dependent on slavery. Okay, it's the only way they were profitable. And by 1860, slaves represented nearly half the population of the lower South. Now, the upper South is a little bit different. Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas were more varied. Okay, they sometimes you did have some plantations. Okay, but other times you have yeoman farmers who were just farmers. Okay, and crops were grown for household use. Okay, border states, which the list is right here. Okay, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. Slavery was disappearing from some of those areas because cotton didn't do so well there. Okay, and 90% of Delaware's black population, half of Maryland's, were already free. Okay, remember they started out as tobacco producers. Okay, but once tobacco sort of kind of went by the wayside, they couldn't necessarily make the shift to cotton because of the climate. So even though they're considered slave-owning states, they are dying out. Okay, so keep that in mind. There's really several Souths: the lower South, the upper South, and the border South. Okay. The next part deals really essentially with the economics of the South. Okay, tobacco, rice, sugar, and livestock are still produced in the South, and this part takes you through that. So there are still other things being produced in the South, but in the lower South and in other parts, cotton becomes the king. It becomes the most dominant part of the South's economy, and it becomes a huge export crop. Okay, exported either to northern textile mills when they get going, or to the or to England. In 1860, really, the Cotton Kingdom was stretched from really North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, through Alabama, Mississippi's Black Belt. Okay, and then through Louisiana on to Texas. Okay, this is kind of what we're talking about here. Okay, cotton production in 1821. You can see where cotton was produced in 1821. Okay, you kind of flip on over there and you get to cotton production in 1859, and this is where really most of the cotton in America is being produced. And huge amounts are being produced here in Alabama and then here in Mississippi as well. Okay, it was profitable. It was so profitable that this becomes a major part right here, and I want to make sure that you all look at this. Okay, slavery becomes a huge engine of economic development. Okay, the slaves were important. They were extremely valuable. They were produced, if you look right up here, okay, millionaires. Okay, so more millionaires per capita lived in Natchez, Mississippi than anywhere in the world. That'll tell you something about the value of cotton, but only happens because of slavery. Okay. Unfortunately, it also blinded the South to changes that were going on in the world around them. The South incorrectly believed that cotton made them invincible, and it certainly doesn't. By 1860, really, it's starting to flip. Cotton is beginning to become really unprofitable in a lot of ways. Okay, so if you look right here in 1860, the price of cotton began a steady decline. Okay, so the South believes it's invincible, but the reality of it, the economics of it, is that cotton is, and the prices of cotton is about to decline. But despite that, cotton had become a major export crop for the South. The textbook now goes on and talks about the various groups. Okay, if you looked at the white South, the top of the ladder is the planter. Okay, only 1 out of 30 whites in 1860 was a planter. Okay, so that means that they are the top of they're the top. Okay, and kind of the agreed definition is you had to own at least 20 slaves to be called a planter. Okay, and if you were a planter, then you had a plantation. Okay, and so some of those slaves were field hands, some of them were house slaves. Okay, and so you can read about the planter society. You have the planter, the plantation mistress, okay, who also had a very important role. Okay, but unfortunately, many plantation mistresses, like Mary Boykin Chestnut and others, were caught up in a system where they were really almost enslaved by the society that had been developed. Okay, and you can read about her, for example, and how she admits that she doesn't have really any rights, that she had to love, honor, and obey and serve her husband, and how they were really bound up in a system that took away some of their freedom as well. Because they were slave owners, they also had to employ overseers and drivers to get the work done out of the slaves. And so another part of any plantation would be the overseers and the drivers who were responsible for making sure that the slaves were doing the work, making sure that they were obeying the master. Okay, and if they didn't, they were punished. Then it kind of goes on and talks about plain white folk who were just people that were white, but they were barely getting by. Okay, now some of them, okay, did have enough money to own a slave or two who they usually had to work alongside, but most don't have any. Okay, and so you can read about really these small farmers, the yeoman farmers, okay, who were really the kind of the middle class of Southern society. And then at the bottom, you get the poor whites, okay. The poor whites were the ones that don't have any land, they don't have any access to slaves, okay, and they were forced into really becoming tenant farmers, okay, working for others. So in a lot of ways, they were really no better than slaves, except they were white, okay, and thus were free, and that was really one of the big distances, okay. They were oftentimes made fun of. They were derided by the plantation owners, just like really just like many of the slaves were. It is that being a poor white was not one of the best things to be, except that they were free. Then, of course, the textbook takes you into the flip side of this and takes a look at slave society in the South, okay, and how that worked. It talks a little bit about the slave codes right out here, and really the legal background for slavery, okay. And it, of course, reminds you that slaves could not learn to read or write, okay. That was a major problem if they were found out to be learning to read or write. At the top are the free persons, all right, free people of color, okay. The freedmen or freed slaves had been part of really American society since almost the beginning, okay. And so you can read about the free blacks as they were sort of called, okay. You could become free by manumission, okay. Your owner could simply free you, okay, if you've done work or you have done such a good job, or because the slave owner may be dying. Sometimes they would free their slaves, okay. You could buy your freedom, okay. Sometimes that was allowed, and there's a document your your SLO assignment that talks about a free black trying to buy the freedom of the rest of his family. So that's part of it. Okay, so make sure that you take a look at the freedmen population. Okay, the slave trade. Technically, the slave trade is over. Okay, the slave trade had been outlawed in 1808. So that had forced slavery into a new direction. Okay, so what happened is once the slave trade closed, domestic slaves became much more valuable, and so slaves became more expensive and more valued. Okay, so between here's a good stat for you right here. Okay, between 1800 and 1860, the price of slaves quadrupled. Okay, one, slavery there were smaller numbers of slaves, that's supply and demand. Two, cotton began to expand and more slaves were needed, and so price is going to go up. Okay, the only way to do that, though, was by natural increase, the kind of code word that was given to the idea of essentially forcing the slaves to breed, to have babies, okay, and if you were a child born into a slave family, then you were born a slave, okay, and so this natural increase idea became a major way where slave numbers were increased. Okay, the slaves were still bought and sold. They could be sold on the auction block. There were slave markets throughout the South. Okay, here's a card from one in Savannah. Okay, so Slaves were inspected. If you wanted to buy or sell a slave, you could. Other people would inspect them. Okay, put a price on them. Okay, and so healthy slaves or young slaves were always going to bring the highest prices. Okay, the the worst thing about this, and the worst thing about the domestic slave trade, is this. Okay, the separation of families. This happened often. It was brutal, where children would be taken from their parents and sold to new masters. Okay, families would be split up, and we all understand the psychological toll that had to have taken on mothers and fathers who saw their children sold to other families. Okay, the it was brutal. Slave markets in New Orleans would sell slaves for sexual partners. Okay, the it is it's it's horrible that slavery was so accepted that buying and selling human beings on the street corner was just sort of accepted in these areas. Slaves had you could if you were a slave, probably the worst thing to be would be a field hand. Okay, and that's what most of them really were. You had to work in the fields, all right, sun up to sundown, sometimes at night during the cotton picking time. If it was a full moon, they worked during the full moon. Okay, they really their clothes were not that great. They went barefoot most of the year. Okay, and it was they didn't have the best food. All right, they of course didn't have the best accommodations. Okay, and they worked really hard 6 days a week. Okay, and whether they were working in sugarcane, whether they were working on a corn, or grinding corn, whether they were working on a cotton plantation, the work was the work. Okay, and the only day off really they had was the Sabbath. The sometimes slaves would be the one sort of step up would be working in the house. If you worked in the plantation house, if you weren't a field hand, then you could work. If you worked in the household, then that tended to be a better job. Okay, so if you got into the household, that kind of tended to be a better step up. Slave women were abused both physically and sexually. They were, of course, used to as they were used as sexual partners by their owners. The the idea was, of course, to make sure that they were being impregnated so that more slaves could be used. Okay, remember slavery is extremely expensive. Okay, the pregnant women sometimes were given some breaks, but they were very quickly back into the field or back at their jobs. Okay, women worked in many cases, especially field hands, just as hard as men did. Okay, sexual abuse was often okay and happened on virtually every plantation. Thomas Jefferson had a long-term relationship with one of his slaves. And it happens on virtually every plantation. Okay, the these were, of course, women as young, or girls as young as 14 and 15 would be abused by the slave owners. So it was a very brutal association. Finally, the book talks a little bit about how enslaved peoples dealt with the horrors of slavery. Okay, And there are a couple of ways. Okay, one is through church, one is through family. Okay, so you can read about the slave family. Slave marriages have no legal status. Okay, but slaveholders sometimes would accept an unofficial marriage, and sometimes may even have performed the marriage themselves. But families oftentimes were split up. Okay, and so really the idea of marriage wasn't accepted on a lot of these plantations. Okay, children, like we said, were bought and sold to new masters. Okay, they were split up and sent to other parts or other states or other farms. Okay, so dealing with the horrors of slavery, some found themselves buried in religion, and slave religion was very deep. It oftentimes brought in other forms of religions. Okay, you all have heard of voodoo, which is a mixture of some of the island uh, religions, right? Along with Catholicism. Okay, so others would kind of mix together some of their African ideals and Christianity. So you see that. One other form of dealing with it was rebellion. Okay, and slave rebellions did happen, and they did happen to they did happen sometimes, and they were terrifying to slave owners. The book goes through several of these. Okay, so you have Gabriel's rebellion, and that is one of them. The German Coast Uprising. Okay, there's one of them there. One of the most famous is the Denmark Vesey Revolt, okay, which is gone into some detail right here in Charleston, okay, in 1822. The plot, the Denmark Vesey plot, is discussed right there, okay, and the Nat Turner Rebellion. So all of these were attempts to lead slave rebellions, and really the Nat Turner's rebellion was probably the most terrifying. So you can read about Nat Turner's rebellion there. Okay. Another form was runaway. Okay, running away and runaway slaves they did happen, and they did begin to set up the Underground Railroad. The idea of getting help and making your way out of the South and towards the North to freedom. So we'll talk a little bit more about the Underground Railroad later on. Okay, so and remember, by the way, the Underground. If you don't know, the Underground Railroad is not a railroad. Okay, it was just what it was called. It's actually a network of safe houses, paths, roads to help fugitive slaves make it from the South to the North. So there was resistance in other ways as well, but running away or participating in a rebellion were some of the most famous. Okay. All right. So the South, or excuse me, the textbook gives you a good deal of information. Okay. If you go back and you get back here and you look at some of this, okay, it kind of sums a lot of this up. But make sure that you understand that the reason that slavery becomes so ingrained in the South is the success of cotton from that period from 1820 to about 1860. Part of that is because of the development of the cotton gin. Part of it is because of prices. Part of it is because of the Industrial Revolution. But it makes the South way too overconfident in an agricultural system, and that eventually will be its downfall. All right,